3 weeks after the funeral, I found the key in a coffee tin on top of the refrigerator. Junie was already on the floor of my mother's bedroom, cross-legged in her school uniform, 6 years old, and utterly unbothered by grief in the particular way small children are. Not because they don't feel loss, but because they haven't yet learned to organize their whole body around it. "What's that, Mom?" Inside the chest was a quilt, folded with the kind of precision my mother brought to everything she didn't trust herself to feel casually about. I lifted it out into the gray afternoon light coming through the window, and it unfolded across the bed like something surfacing. It was made of dozens of fabric squares, no two alike, stitched together in a pattern that made sense only once you stopped trying to find the pattern and simply looked at the whole. And it was unfinished. One entire corner still raw-edged, a scatter of loose squares pinned but not yet sewn, as though my mother had set it down mid-sentence and simply never come back to finish what she was saying. I sat on the edge of the bed longer than I meant to, running my thumb along a seam, before Junie climbed up beside me and put her small hand flat on a faded yellow square near the center. "Why does this one feel different?" I knew immediately what it was, the way you know your own name without having to think about it. Corduroy, worn nearly smooth. My kindergarten jumper. The one I wore the day I got a gold star on a drawing of our house. The one my mother framed and kept above the kitchen table for 11 years until it finally fell down during a storm, and neither of us ever put it back up. "That was a dress I wore when I was about your age," I said. The fabric was almost smooth under my thumb, the way something loved too hard becomes soft. "Grandma made you a dress?" "No, baby. Grandma turned my old clothes into blankets, every year for as long as I can remember." Junie considered this with the seriousness only children bring to information that isn't actually a question. She moved her hand to the next square, a strip of pale blue flannel, soft as breath. "And this one?" I had to look away from her for a second before I answered that one. I was 9, and sick enough that the doctor used the word precaution in the tone adults use when they mean something worse than what they're saying. I remember the ceiling of my room more clearly than I remember most of my 20s. A water stain shaped like a rabbit. My mother's shadow moving across it each time she leaned over to check my temperature, hour after hour, in a chair she'd dragged from the kitchen and never dragged back. That blue flannel was the pajama set she'd bought for the hospital in case, and never had to use, because I got better before we needed it, and she cut it into a quilt square instead of ever explaining why she'd kept it at all. I hadn't remembered that chair until my hand was on the fabric. That's the thing no one warns you about grief. It isn't the big absences that undo you. It's the small mechanical ones. A chair, a brand of flannel, the particular ordinary Tuesdayness of being 9 and sick and entirely certain, for the first time in your life, that someone would sit in a hard kitchen chair all night rather than let you be afraid alone. "Mommy!" "I'm okay," I said, which was, at that exact moment, a small architectural lie. A structure built quickly to hold weight it wasn't designed for. I build houses for a living. Beautiful ones. I have won awards for the way I let light enter a room, for staircases that seem to float, for kitchens that make strangers weep a little when they walk into them for the first time, the way people sometimes weep at things that are simply unbearably well made. I used to think that was the whole of my talent, an instinct for exactly where the light should fall. It took me until I was 34, kneeling on my dead mother's bedroom floor, to understand that I had spent 15 years designing gorgeous rooms for other families to sit in together, and had not managed, in all that time, to sit in my mother's kitchen more than 4 or 5 times a year. I always meant to visit more. I want to be exact about that, because I think it matters. The difference between not caring and always meaning to. Though standing in that room, I wasn't sure anymore that the difference was as large as I'd always told myself it was. Every year had a reason. A deadline, a pitch, a client flying in, a school event of Junie's I couldn't miss because I had already missed the last 2. My mother never once made me feel guilty for any of it, which I see now, too late to do anything useful with the insight, was its own kind of quiet devastation. She absorbed the absence so gracefully that I mistook her grace for evidence that the absence didn't cost her anything. It cost her a quilt's worth of Tuesdays. I just wasn't the one keeping count. Junie had moved further down the pattern by then, small fingers walking across the fabric like she was reading Braille. She stopped on a square of pale green cotton, printed with tiny white flowers, and went very still in the particular way children go still, right before they ask something enormous without meaning to. Is this one from a happy day or a sad day? She didn't look up. Her finger stayed pressed on the tiny white flowers, as if the answer might be hidden in the print. I hadn't touched that fabric in 20 years, but my whole body recognized it before my mind caught up. The blouse I was wearing the last time my mother and I truly fought. The kind of fight where both people say the smallest, sharpest thing they can find, aiming for wherever it will do the most damage. I don't remember anymore what started it. I remember only that I told her, at 22, home for a weekend, I resented having to spend there. That I wasn't going to spend my whole life in a town too small to hold what I wanted to become. I remember her face doing something I'd never seen it do before. Not hurt exactly, more like a door quietly closing somewhere behind her eyes, out of self-protection rather than anger. I left 2 days early. I didn't apologize for 11 months, and when I finally did, we both agreed, with the practiced ease of people who love each other and don't know what else to do with a wound like that, to simply never bring it up again. I never knew she'd kept that blouse. I certainly never imagined her sitting somewhere, alone, cutting it into a neat square and stitching it into the same quilt as the corduroy dress and the flannel pajamas, placing the worst afternoon of our life together in the same pattern as the gentlest ones, as though grief and love were simply 2 more fabrics that happened to look right next to each other. Both, I told Junie, because it was the only honest answer, and because I have decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that I would rather my daughter learn early that both things can be true in the same square of cloth than learn it the way I did at 34, kneeling on a dead woman's floor with my whole chest caving quietly inward. It was the last square that undid the small, careful architecture I'd built to get through that afternoon. It sat at the unfinished corner, pinned but not yet sewn. A scrap of soft gray cotton, printed with a faint pattern I recognized instantly, because I owned the shirt it came from. I was wearing it in a photograph I'd texted my mother 4 months ago, Junie on my shoulders at the beach, both of us laughing at something already forgotten. My mother had texted back a single heart, the way she always did, brief enough that I'd never once stopped to wonder what she did with the photographs after she'd looked at them. She had gone out. I would learn this later from my aunt, in the flat voice people use for details too painful to editorialize, and bought fabric to match a shirt she'd never touched from a photo on a phone screen, so that a moment she wasn't present for could still find its way into the only language she'd ever fully trusted to say the things she couldn't say out loud. She was still sewing us together 3 weeks before she died. She simply ran out of time to finish the stitch. The gray cotton was soft in a way the others weren't. New, almost unused. It still smelled faintly of the store. I don't remember deciding to cry. Junie's arms went around my neck without being asked. The unthinking generosity of a child who doesn't yet know there's anything to fix, only that her mother needs holding. She stayed there, cheek against my shoulder, while I sat on the floor for what must have been a long time, my hand flat against a square of gray cotton that had never once been inside my mother's actual house. In a house I would soon have to sell to strangers who would never know any of this had happened inside these walls. I didn't finish the quilt that day. I want to be honest about that too, because I've come to distrust any version of this story that resolves too quickly, as if grief were a room you could simply finish decorating and then walk away from. But I took it home, and 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, I had deliberately kept empty. No deadline, no pitch, nothing I let myself call more important. I sat at my own kitchen table with a needle and the unfinished corner spread across my lap. And I began, badly, to close the seam my mother never got to close herself. Junie sat beside me, cutting a small square of fabric from a shirt she'd already outgrown, because she'd decided, without my ever suggesting it, that the quilt wasn't actually finished. That it was only exactly as unfinished as it was supposed to be, always one Tuesday behind whoever was still alive to keep loving the people in it. I am not a careful seamstress. My stitches are uneven, and I suspect if my mother could see them, she would say so gently, the way she said most true things. But the quilt is warmer now, and heavier, and it sits on the end of Junie's bed, growing by one square every year on her birthday, cut from whatever she outgrows, whether or not I remember, that year, to tell her exactly why. Some days I still hear myself, at 22, saying I wasn't going to spend my whole life in a town too small to hold what I wanted to become. I understand now that I had it backwards. The town was never too small. I simply hadn't yet learned how much room a person can make in one plain kitchen chair for someone they refuse to stop waiting for.
If you believe the world still needs stories about kindness, hope, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, welcome home. Subscribe to Bekalia Studios, and let's keep these stories alive together.